Thank you so much for joining us. We are here with another program in the Wild Maine series in partnership with the Center for Wildlife Studies. And the president of the Center for Wildlife Studies, Jack Hopkins, couldn't be here tonight. So instead, he's asked me to tell you a little bit about the Center for Wildlife Studies. It's a Maine nonprofit made up of experienced researchers and educators who provide training, support research projects, and put on events for Maine communities like this Wild Maine series to educate about wildlife conservation. And you can visit their website. I'll put it in the chat in a moment. Tonight we are here with Phillip deMaynadier, wildlife biologist for Maine's Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife, where he leads the wildlife diversity section. He's authored over 50 scientific publications, is active on numerous state and national wildlife technical committees, and serves on the graduate faculty at University of Maine's Department of Wildlife, Fisheries, and Conservation Biology. And he was also the co-coordinator of the Maine Butterfly Survey, and I think we'll be learning a bit about that tonight. And everybody on Zoom, you can, as usual, type your questions into the chat or Q&A, and I can read them out loud at the end. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Phillip.
Thank you, Julia. Good evening, everybody. Thanks for your interest in all things wild and winged. We're going to talk about butterflies tonight. I am with the Wildlife Diversity section at Maine Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife, which is it's a unit within the department, relatively new unit within the department, comprised of biologists that focus almost entirely on non-game and endangered species issues. And they do so across all taxa, really, including invertebrates, as you'll find out tonight. So just to remind you that this particular speaker series is being sponsored by some of the organizations you see here. This is what I was going to talk about. I think this will be about a 55 minute talk just to get you oriented. I'm going to start very broadly with invertebrates, just get us all on the same page as to why we should care about them, why they're so important globally in terms of ecosystem function. Then we'll drill into the reason you're here tonight, which is butterflies and moths, and a little bit of flirt, just a little bit with identification. We obviously don't have much time to do that. I'll share some results of the Maine Butterfly Survey project, and then a few words about conservation. So this graph and the numbers and the data here is probably something you've been exposed to in some form elsewhere. But it's really important to remember that insects are the dominant form of life on Earth. Now, I know the data here is dated 1992, but I've looked this up, and there's now about 2 million species described on Earth, and yet the pattern's almost identical. That is to say, half of all species described on Earth are insects. And in fact, if you look at the second column there of other animals, even though there's a charismatic vertebrate sitting on top of that histogram, the vast majority of those species are invertebrates, non-insect invertebrates, like other arthropods, spiders, crustaceans, crayfish, in other invertebrate groups, jellyfish, worms, so on and so forth. So in fact, something like 95% of all species, of all wildlife, of all animals, should specify on Earth, are invertebrates. So if you care about biological diversity, you kind of have to care about the little things. And tonight, we're talking about one group of insects, the Maine Lepidoptera. That's the order of butterflies and moths. Lepidoptera is Latin for scaled wings. And keep in mind, I think there's like 26 orders of insects in Maine. So we're just talking about one of them. And yet, just in this one group, this one order, there's 3,000 species described in Maine. Most of them are moths, so you you won't get, I won't overwhelm you with those guys tonight. But the point being that just in this one group, there's 5 times more species, 5 times more species than all of the vertebrates in Maine combined. All of the birds, mammals, reptiles, amphibians, and fish, times 5 doesn't quite equal just the diversity of Maine Lepidoptera, let alone all the other insect orders. And so they're not only really dominant in terms of biomass and diversity, but they're extremely important. And so E.O. Wilson, who most of you have heard of, I hope, one of the most famous biologists, recently passed, called them the little things that run the world. And what he basically went on to say was that without insects, all human life would basically come to a screeching halt. In fact, all higher life would. And it's not hyperbole. He's basically referring to this and more in terms of the suite of ecosystem services that invertebrates provide. And these are just, fundamental anchors to life that we kind of take for granted, just percolating along in the background in the soil litter and stuff in the canopy of the trees, and yet they're so essential to all life on Earth. And I just highlighted 2, I'll just mention the 2 on top because they perhaps butterflies and moths fit there particularly well. Keep in mind that all of Maine's bats, nearly all of our fish eat insects at some point in their life history. And most Maine birds do, in fact. And Maine birds focus on caterpillars in particular, caterpillars of moths and butterflies. And in fact, the thrushes and vireos and warblers that are trickling into the state this spring now, they're making that migration. The evolution has driven that migratory behavior precisely because at north temperate latitudes, such as here in the Northeast, we have this incredible flush of food, which is dominated by caterpillars. And birds are taking advantage of that. The other thing that many insects do, including butterflies and moths, is help with pollination. Over 80% of wild plants on the globe, not just in Maine, are animal pollinated. Most of those are insect pollinated. And essentially 1 in 3 bites of your food are given to you as a result of insect pollination. So it's an important load that they're lifting. And thankfully, the Maine Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife does recognize invertebrates as wildlife. That might seem trite, but many states' fish and wildlife agencies do not. I would estimate about half do not. And so wildlife is defined in Maine as birds, mammals, reptiles, amphibians, and invertebrates. And when we add those last 2 words, we're talking about 16,000 species just in Maine of inland non-marine invertebrates. And so that's great. It's excellent that the state agency that has jurisdiction over the conservation and protection of wildlife is also keeping an eye out for invertebrates, but it's also a little overwhelming and potentially paralyzing. And so with our small staff, we've decided among invertebrates, we're just really going to focus on those groups that are most at risk. And so that's just it's one of the ways we can triage our efforts, is to focus on species and groups, guilds that we know have species that need attention here in Maine. And we do have a list of 57 Maine endangered and threatened species. This is just a collage of them that Mark McCullough, former endangered species biologist, put together. And as you look along the margins of the poster, you can see some invertebrates, right? Some Lepidoptera and some other insects and some freshwater mussels. So indeed, invertebrates are represented, and they even get some regulatory protections under the Endangered Species Act. And if we look at the sort of full suite of what are the invertebrates that are getting attention in Maine, and this is kind of reflective of the Northeast overall, I would say. This is what you see, and it looks impressive, and you know it is. But keep in mind, there's 26 orders of insects and many other invertebrate groups that are non-insect arthropods. But nonetheless, these are the groups we're tackling for now. And of course, tonight's subject is butterflies and moths, and they're one of two groups that actually dominate the attention of invertebrate zoologists throughout the Northeast, really, in state agencies. That is, butterflies and moths and damselflies and dragonflies are two groups that we sort of know the most about in terms of being able to assess populations and determine who's rare and who's common, habitat relationships, et cetera. So about 2/3 of Maine invertebrates that have been listed as either endangered, threatened, special concern, or a species of greatest conservation need. That last category is a non-regulatory watch list, are comprised of these two orders, the Lepidoptera and the Odonata. So the sort of glass half full perspective here is that the group that you signed up to learn about tonight is getting a fair amount of attention. The glass half empty is that there's a bunch of critters in the butterfly and moth group that need a lot of attention. About 1 in 5 species, in fact, in Maine, and among the butterflies, about 20% of our fauna are listed as one of these at-risk categories. So let's delve into a little bit of biology real quick. Don't get too shocked by this slide. But this is just a quick refresher, again, from Biology 101 in high school, where remember that organisms are classified into different groups, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. And so we're talking about the Lepidoptera, which is an order within the class Insecta. And insects are arthropods that have an exoskeleton, jointed body parts, and 3 sets of legs, three body parts. Usually have antenna and wings. And so here's one of the 26 orders, butterflies and moths, and among them, there's 120 species of butterflies. Look at that number above that, though. So all the rest are moths. We won't talk much more about moths tonight, but the pattern you see there in terms of diversity difference is very much the same pretty much anywhere in the world. There tends to be at least an order of magnitude more moths than butterflies. I think there's like 18,000 butterflies described worldwide and something like 180,000 described moths. And it's probably helpful, given the diversity of moths and that you will inevitably run into, to be able to discriminate them from butterflies, right? On this slide, the top 2 animals are butterflies and the bottom 2 are moths. Real quickly, though, the one in the middle is neither, and it's a caddisfly, and it's believed that that caddisflies are the closest living relative to the groups, the Lepidoptera, butterflies, and moths, and that they may have, fossils suggest that they split apart at about 200 million years ago. And caddisflies do have somewhat of a resemblance to butterflies and moths, and they even have scaled wings, as do butterflies and moths. So how do you tell these guys apart? Well, there's a few characters. None of them are perfect in that there's exceptions to most of these. So moths tend to be nocturnal, as you know, which means they often have duller colors. They're not using visual input to discriminate with one another. They're using pheromones more often. And so they're not particularly well developed in terms of sight, but in terms of chemical detection, they're super strong, and they have these antennae that are sort of long, dissected radars for picking up molecules of preferably the same species, opposite sex, and they tend to be hairy to keep their body heat up at night. But probably the very best character of all, because there's exceptions to all of those that I just mentioned, is the club on the antenna. So all butterflies will have that little knob on the tip of the antenna, or in the case of skippers, the upper right, a hooked knob. Napiculus is the fancy name. And moths won't have that swelling at the tip of the antenna ever, as far as I know, as far as I've learned or encountered to date. But you do need to be careful, because there's day flying, colorful, beautiful, conspicuous moths. And here's just a few. We have the 2 species on the left, right, in Maine. But again, these aren't, well, I guess you could tell on the lower left and the right that there's no club or swelling at the tip of these antennas. So you're good with your call on moth. Life cycle of butterflies and moths looks like this. I'm just using the monarch as an example. We call the life cycle of advanced insects, as we refer to it as complete metamorphosis. And you'll sometimes hear incomplete metamorphosis for the more primitive group of insects. And the difference is basically whether there's a pupal component to the life history. So with say some of the older lineages like dragonflies and grasshoppers and crickets, they will just have an egg, a larvae, or an immature form that grows slowly into the adult. They won't have that transitional resting stage as a pupa. And the pupal phase backing up for a moment, so the egg is laid, it hatches out, usually after a week or 2, into a caterpillar or larvae. Those are synonyms, essentially. And the caterpillar goes through 5 or 6 instars, they call it, so growth stages, where it sheds its skin each time. And the last instar sheds into and develops into the pupa, which is this resting phase. It's sort of deceptively quiescent, that phase, because what's actually happening inside the pupa is really dramatic. It's unlike almost anything else in the animal world, in that the caterpillar is completely breaking down and almost liquefying, and dormant developmental cells come alive that express proteins that develop into the adult form, which emerges from the pupa, usually a week or 2 after, probably closer to 2 weeks in general for most species in Maine. And the adult lifespan of the adult is short. Most adult butterfly species in Maine are only going to live for a few weeks. But at any point in the 12 months of the year, all of these things are on the landscape in some form. And how is that? Well, that's because these are the overwintering stages. And I sort of developed, the size of the picture is sort of proportional to the number of species in Maine and probably the Northeast that overwinter in that form of the life history. So most of our species overwinter as caterpillars and larvae or eggs, but some of them do as pupa and chrysalises. Again, synonyms, pupa and chrysalis. Very few do so as adults. But at this point, at this mid-April, you've got examples of all of these happening for the 120 species in Maine. That minority of adult butterflies that overwinter are kind of interesting, so I want to talk about them a few more minutes. Here they are, basically in as we know them. There's I think 13 or 14 species. The ones in white, the 3 top, morning cloak, commas, and tortoise shells, they're resident adult overwinters. So, and think about what that means. So if a mourning cloak or a comma or tortoiseshell, any butterfly, whether you know these species or not, as an adult is overwintering, say under some bark or in a woodshed or in a rock wall, you can imagine that on those first warm spring days, they are the very first butterflies that you see emerging. Indeed, mourning cloaks and commons are the ones that, if you've seen any so far in Maine, those are almost undoubtedly the species you've seen, because they're ready to go. They're right. They don't have to pass through any other life stages. The other ones from the question mark down to the monarch are also overwinter as adults, but as partial or long distance migrants. So they leave the state, either traveling to southern New England or the deep southeast, or even to Mexico to overwinter before their progeny return. And the one that is most spectacular in this regard are the monarchs, right? It's probably the best studied, most well-known butterfly in the world, really. And I'm sure to many of you so the monarchs that we have in Maine are especially kind of interesting, because if you look up in the northeast where this diagram starts, it's one of the farthest distances that monarchs migrate anywhere on the continent. So the whole population of monarchs east of the Rocky Mountains migrate in the fall down to essentially one location just northwest of Mexico City, in these high elevation volcanic mountains at about a dozen sites that are dominated by large old oil mill fir trees. But on a broad geographic scale, this is essentially one site that all of the North American monarchs, except for those west of the Rockies, which go to California, migrate to every year. And what's fascinating is that, let's pick it up from Maine, say last October would have been when our monarchs departed Maine, in all likelihood, that last generation, which forgoes reproduction, and as a result is able to develop a slightly large body form because they don't expend resources on reproduction. That larger wing girth and size allows them to be a little better for such a long journey, a journey that can be over 3,000 miles in Maine or in Nova Scotia to these mountains in Mexico. And they spend the whole winter there in these huge groups, draped on the trees to the point where in some areas you can't even see the foliage of the trees. The green trees are essentially entirely orange. And then they begin their migration back north. That same individual that left Maine last October. That generation then initially reproduces in the Gulf states of the Southeast. And then the progeny of that individual will then make its way up all the way north to the Northeast. And so our monarchs show up from that migratory population sometime in June or July, usually in Maine. And then there's 2 or 3 generations that reproduce in Maine on milkweed. And then those animals that are 3, 4 generations removed in some cases from their ancestors that spent the winter in Mexico somehow know exactly where to go. And scientists are still trying to figure this out because there's presumably no cultural transmission of information. And so it's not clear how monarchs that have never made this journey before return to the exact same spot as their successful ancestors did. It's fun to have some mysteries still to solve in nature. This real quick on the story about monarch population trends isn't pretty. It's actually one of the better studied animals, as I said, of perhaps any other insect, really. We have 20 years plus of data, 30 years, sorry, of data from those overwintering roost sites in Mexico. And what's interesting is, it's just logistically impossible to count individual monarch butterflies, right? Because there's hundreds of thousands of them on these old growth fir trees. So what scientists do is they estimate the physical footprint, the area that's inhabited by overwintering monarchs. And so what you see on the top of these graphs are hectares. And the 30-year average for area occupied by monarchs in Mexico is about 5 hectares or maybe 12, 13 acres. Look at I just got this data yesterday for 20, this past winter. The estimation is less than a hectare. So it's the second lowest population estimate on record in the past 30 years. And if you look at the data overall, it's about an 80% decline over time. So much so that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is actually considering listing the monarch, amazingly, as a federally endangered or threatened species. Why did I want to revisit this? I think before we leave sort of biology and life history, there's one other component that's really fascinating about butterflies and moths that we have to touch on, which is reproduction. So how did that adult know where to lay that egg? And does it matter where it lays its egg? And so that, the caterpillar, can the caterpillar basically eat wherever it's hatched from? And the answer is, it does matter. And no, the caterpillar can't eat most of the plants on the landscape. So the parents have to be really choosy about where they lay their eggs. The adult butterflies, as I said, they only live for a few weeks. They're basically feeding and reproducing. It's the two things on their mind. And the males will transfer a spermatophore to the female. Unlike sperm in almost all other organisms, which is frankly relatively cheap to produce and abundant, spermatophores in Lepidoptera are they're about 5% of the body weight of the adult male. So it's a huge investment that it's transferring to the female, and it's filled with amino acids and nutrients that help the female develop her eggs. She then is careful to be very choosy about where she lays those eggs, because unlike the adults, which feed on basically sugar water, which is nectar and it's everywhere, adults are not especially choosy about what flowers they drink from. The caterpillars are incredibly choosy and can only feed on certain species of plant. This is as a result of millions of years of evolution. So flowering plants and butterflies and moths evolved about 140 million years ago together, and there's been an evolutionary arms race ever since, basically where plants, not just in defense to Lepidoptera, but to all herbivores, plants develop these secondary compounds that are toxic or that repel herbivory. That's why the world is green. Otherwise, everything would be eaten, because there's a lot of herbivores out there, from insects to vertebrates. And butterflies and moths have become more and more specialized to develop secondary compounds and metabolites and enzymes to break down those toxic compounds. And eventually, over time, those relationships can become extremely tight, such that in this case, the Baltimore checker spot can only lay its eggs on turtle head, actually a kind of an uncommon, unique wildflower, or English plantain, which is an introduced species, which they crossed over to. And but just in the early larval stages, those are the only two real host plants here in Maine. Now, the host plant, and that's what we refer to those plants that the caterpillars feed on as host plants. It's just a term, or food plants. And sort of that specialization can vary quite a bit. And so here's two opposite extremes within the same family, the swallowtails. Canadian tiger swallowtails are considered a host generalist because they can eat a lot of different stuff on the landscape, a lot of sort of early successional hardwood shrubs and trees. just in that group of 5 genera there's about 20 species in Maine. So as a result, you see a lot of Canadian tiger swallowtails. I bet everybody in this room and on this Zoom call has seen this tiger swallowtail every year, in fact. Whereas the spicebush swallowtail, which I dare say most of you haven't ever seen in Maine anyway, is a house specialist, and it only eats, its caterpillars can only develop on spicebush and sassafras, 2 rare plants in their own right in Maine that reach the northern edge of their range in southern Maine. And so as a result, their distributions look something like this. The Canadian tiger swallowtail is everywhere. It's fairly common. It's very secure, large population sizes, and the spicebush swallowtail, highly restricted just to southern York County, where the only place where its host plant can grow in Maine. So host plant biology is key to Lepidoptera biology. And if you're looking for a particular species to add to your checklist, you want to read in your field guide or your atlas, which I'll introduce you to shortly here for Maine. You'll want to read about what its host plant is, because you're going to want to target those habitats that have host plants if you're going to find those species. All right, very short section here on identification. Back to our phylogeny here and where butterflies stand. We have 5 families: the swallowtails, whites, gossamer wings, brushfoots, and skippers. You can see the diversity of species among those 5 families, with the gossamer wings and the brushfoots and skippers certainly dominant in terms of diversity. And the swallowtails, really beautiful, right? These are the large guys with the long tail protrusions, very conspicuous. I think most people know a swallowtail when they see it, at least to the group. We have 7 species in Maine. Only 3 or 4 of those are resident. The long tail is interesting, and it's somewhat debated as to its function. Some scientists argue that it confers some aerodynamic advantages for flying, and in fact, they have proven that it does. But there's also, it can certainly have more than one function. And another likely function is that it mimics what appears to be the antenna of an organism that's actually near the rear end of the ventral hind wing, which is a highly disposable part of the butterfly. So the vital parts of that butterfly are the abdomen, thorax, and head, which are at the other end of those tails, right? So when a bird or a shrew or something attacks an adult butterfly, they're interested in the vital material. They don't want just sort of chitinous wings. They want some juicy morsels, and so they're going to head for those tails, because that's likely where the body is. And the butterfly often escapes with a notch in its tail from a bird beak, and lives to see another day as a result of that disguise.
What is mud puddling?
Good question. So mud puddling, that's a cool, yeah, thank you. A lot of butterflies do mud puddling, especially the brushfoots and swallowtails and the whites and sulfurs. And it's basically an activity that mostly males partake in, and they're collecting sodium and other nutrients to help with the development of spermatophores. So
they eat them?
They soak up the salts and that are more they're dissolved in wet puddly areas, and they don't have, as you can see in perhaps the center photo, the black swallowtail photo. If you look carefully, actually in the giant swallowtail as well, you can see the proboscis and so butterflies don't have a chewing mouth part. They have a straw basically that coils up and that they can uncoil and suck nectar from flowers, or in the case of mud puddling, minerals and nutrients out of little puddles. Whites and yellows, our second family. You can tell these guys because there really are no other butterflies that are white or yellow. They might seem like mundane colors, but they're actually really quite rare among Lepidoptera, those colors, and even among insects. White and yellow pigment is produced by pterines, which are, well, the pterines come from an accumulation of uric acid in the caterpillar form that then is sequestered into the wings and helps develop these white and yellow forms that are characteristics of the sulfurs and whites. We have 9 species in Maine. About half of them are resident, half are not. And what else? Perhaps one other little anecdote about the whites and yellows is that it's thought that it was a Eurasian sulfur. I don't know what species, but one of the orange or yellow sulfurs in Europe that was the inspiration for the very first reference to butterflies. So that's kind of cool. Yeah. And Maine now, just for your own information, does have a Maine state butterfly as of last year. And the pink-edged sulfur was nominated by elementary school class at Old Orchard Beach. I sort of helped the teacher and the kids learn about butterflies and narrow down some candidates, and they picked this species. They thought it was cool because no other state had picked one, and that it has a very northern distribution, so it kind of makes it a northern New England, Maine specialty. And probably what really sold them was that, guess what its host plant is? The Maine state fruit, blueberries. So pink-edged sulfurs only eat blueberry plants as caterpillars. And kids thought that was cool. And we now have a Maine state butterfly. Next family are the gossamer wings. These are just an exquisite group, very diverse. They have incredible color variation. They tend to be very small. All the animals on this slide are about the size of your thumbnail. And yet, if you take the time to look carefully for these guys, you will be rewarded through your binoculars with just incredible color variation and some really interesting behaviors. Talk about host plant specialists. Some of these gossamer wings are super specialized. In fact, the one in the center of the screen there, the Hessel's hairstreak, only eats a single plant species on the face of the earth, and that is Atlantic white cedar. Not common northern white cedar, Atlantic white cedar, which isn't actually a cedar, it's a cypress, but it's a rare plant in Maine. It just gets into, it's actually fairly rare across its range on the East Coast. And as a result, the Hessel's hairstreak is indeed very rare, it's state endangered. It only occurs in a few cedar swamps in York County. The other cool thing about gossamer wings is many of them, especially the hairstreaks and blues, have a symbiotic relationship with ants, whereby the caterpillars are tended by ants, not attacked or eaten by the ants. And that's because the caterpillars emit a sugary honeydew solution as they're feeding. On the other end, they're emitting this solution that the ants tap into. And the ants have figured out over evolutionary time that this is a creature that's worth taking care of. And so they defend the caterpillars from parasitoids and other predators. And some of these relationships can be quite specific as well, where there's only a couple ant or one ant species that's responsible for the successful development of that caterpillar, which then grows into an adult by eating perhaps only one or two plant species. So very specialized relationships in gossamer wings. The brushfoots are the most diverse group that we have in Maine. This has the commas and fritillaries and crescents and checker spots and satyrs. What else? Well, our monarchs and viceroys are in here. So a very diverse group. They can vary from very small to very large in size. They do include a lot of our overwintering groups. The commas and mourning cloaks are in this group. And some of our migratory adult overwinters are in this group as well, such as the painted lady. And brushfoots are so named because, remember I said that all insects have 6 legs. Well, if you look at the upper right photo, probably the only photo I took in this entire slide program, by the way.
I saw another
Okay. You saw another. Good.
photo.
Oh, right, cool. You'll see only two sets of legs, right? So where's the third set? Well, that's pretty much the way it looks in profile for all brushfoots, because the third set are really abbreviated and they're just tucked up under the chin. They are there. They do have a third set of legs, but they're pretty much used for chemoreception only, not for ambulation. So they will actually tap leaves with their front feet to taste them to see if they're suitable as, guess what, host plants. So they'll use their antenna, they'll use visual cues, and they'll puncture the surface of the leaf with their feet and taste, so to speak, the chemistry of the plant to see if it's suitable for laying eggs. And the last family are the skippers. And we have quite a few of those. They tend to be the little brown jobs. A lot of people tend to or prefer to overlook the skippers because they can be pretty challenging at first. But you do so at your own peril because they're a very cool group. There's a lot to learn and be excited about with the skippers. They too can be really host specific in some cases. A lot of them just eat grasses and sedges. They come in sort of 2 basic forms: a spread wing group that have their wings open at rest, and a closed wing or partially closed wing group, which are the grass and dicot skippers. And yeah, they have very rapid flight that's kind of unpredictable and sporadic in its movements, and hence the name skipper. And then the Maine Butterfly Survey Project. So much of what I'm sharing with you tonight and much more is the result of this project. It really had 2 basic goals. One was science and one was outreach. Selfishly, we wanted to learn as much as we could about the biology, distribution, and abundance of the butterflies in Maine. And so we recruited citizen scientists from throughout the state to help us gather as much information as possible in what we thought was going to be a 5-year project, but ended up being a 10-year project. It was sort of hard to turn off the tap. Once you train and have an excited cadre of volunteers, it just doesn't make sense to stop sometimes. And the other goal, which I think we certainly met, was to just increase public appreciation of butterflies and invertebrates generally. Butterflies are a really great sort of gateway group into the world of invertebrate zoology. They're colorful, they're sun-loving. You don't have to get up at the crack of dawn because you're not going to see any if you do. They like dry, sunny weather that opens flowery habitats, and you can actually, see them through your binoculars. You don't need a microscope. And they're not overwhelmingly diverse. With 120 species, you can conceivably learn them all, or a good number of them. So they're a great group for introducing sort of amateur naturalists to the world of vertebrates generally. And this is just one of several citizen science projects that our department, and often in collaboration with a partner like Maine Audubon, are sponsoring or have sponsored. So the butterfly project there has ended. Several of these have, but we've had a damselfly and dragonfly project. The breeding bird project has just wrapped up. The reptile and amphibian project never ends, and we have 30 years plus of data. And we're actually publishing an atlas to the reptiles and amphibians with University of Maine Press later this year. But there's several citizen science projects that really benefit our understanding of some of these lesser known groups, because we can collect a lot of information in a short period of time. Just to help make that point, you can see in terms of the summary statistics here, we trained and had participation by a good number of volunteers. There's been a lot of attention to our website. We collected 27,000 new records for butterflies as a result of the project. Some of those were really quite significant, like new state records, one new US national record that my son found, actually. And Emmett, and we've had several scientific publications, and one of which I'd like to share with you tonight is a result of a collaboration we had with our partners in the maritime provinces. So it just so happens that the Maritimes Butterfly Atlas overlapped with the Maine Butterfly Atlas. And by Maritimes, I'm referring to New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and Prince Edward Island. And so the coordinators for both projects, myself and Herb Wilson and Ron Butler, and spoke to John Klemko, the coordinator for the Maritimes, and said, why don't we put our data together and produce a unified atlas of the butterfly fauna of the Acadian region? And in large part because the habitats and many of the species in Maine, we share a lot more with some of our southern Nova Scotia and New Brunswick biogeography than we do with southern New England, certainly, and even parts of New Hampshire and Vermont and Massachusetts. So it made a lot of sense, and it was going to be a great opportunity given that we overlapped in our. And so we took us a long time. I won't lie. When did it was at, I think 2015, 2016, when the Maine Butterfly Atlas wrapped up. Let me see, double check that. Yeah, 2015. And then 8 years later, we have this, but it's a really nice publication that's just come out on the butterflies of Maine and the Canadian Maritime Provinces. Has all the authors that I've credited so far, including John Calhoun. And if anybody is interested in this guide, I'd encourage you to explore it on Amazon. You could also email Julia Sagasser and ask for a 30% discount coupon, and I would be willing to provide that to you. You can order it that way. It's not a field guide per se. There's a lot of field guides out there. There really wasn't a need for another field guide. What this is once you've determined which species you have, this is everything else you ever wanted to know. So it's biology, it's which host plants it eats, when it flies, exactly where it's distributed, whether it's rare or endangered, et cetera, et cetera. And here's, as a result of those citizen science projects, I wasn't lying when I said they really can amass a lot of data in a short period of time. So this is the history of data collection as we know it for butterflies in Maine and the Maritimes since the late 19th century to today. And guess when those spikes occurred, right? It was in the early 2000s that both citizen science atlasing projects took off. And, we just doubled, tripled, quadrupled in some cases for some groups, the number of records of butterflies that we would, as a result of those, as a result of a fairly short period of time with trained volunteers. Another way to look at that is in terms of sampling intensity. So the map on the left is the historic baseline that we started with before we kicked off the project. That's the number. It says species, it's really the number of records. So a record is a single species caught in this or observed in a single location on a particular day. So compare that to the number of records amassed as a result of the atlas on the right, and you can see that we filled in a lot of blanks. Of course, Northwest Maine is always problematic. So I'll wrap up with just a few comments about conservation because, we care about these things. They're cool. I hope I've convinced you they're pretty neat and that some of them need attention. We tend to think of insects as being just, they're abundant by definition, right? I see these things flying around in the sky. They're around my head. I'm swatting at them. They have to be abundant. They're everywhere. Well, it's not true. And in fact, we often think of Maine as a wilderness that's immune to a lot of the biodiversity losses that we hear about occurring elsewhere. And I share this just to show that we do have our own wall of shame here. These are over 45 species that we know to be extinct. That means absent from planet Earth, never to be found again, or extirpated. So extinct in Maine, but still extant elsewhere in their range for now. And we have quite a few. And in fact, half of these species, half of the animal species on this list are insects, right? So insects are not immune to this problem. And in fact, the list of insects that are extirpated in Maine is probably much longer than this because obviously they're not as well studied as our vertebrates are. So it is something we need to be concerned about with insects and butterflies in particular. So as we see, we have 10 endangered and threatened butterflies and moths, 20 special concern, 47 on our watch list. And these are the main threats. A lot of these are the same threats affecting biological diversity writ large in planet Earth, but a few are very specific or fairly specific to Lepidoptera. Habitat loss is a big one for most taxa on Earth, and especially loss to development. Unfortunately, in Maine, guess where most of that habitat loss is occurring? It's occurring in southwestern Maine, which is in mid-coast and somewhat in central Maine, which is precisely where we have the highest species richness of Lepidoptera. It's also, in fact, where we have, if you were to map the diversity of rare and endangered animals, species at risk, generally across all taxa, birds, mammals, insects, you'd see a pattern like the one on the left here, which is, again, that southwestern Maine is a real hot spot. And yet, if you look at the map on the right, it's an area where we have a dearth of conservation land. So precisely in the area of southern and central Maine, where we don't have much public conservation land, is exactly where we have the highest population densities, the greatest rate of land conversion, greatest amount of habitat fragmentation, and projected growth in terms and land use conversion. So it's kind of a recipe for it's a very challenging situation, and we do, if we want to balance development with the conservation of our full biota and not add any more species to that extirpation list, we need to spend a lot of conservation effort in southern Maine and not necessarily in northern Maine, which is taking pretty good care of itself. Just wanted to mention a couple other threats here. I guess I'll mention insecticides and herbicides because they're somewhat specific. That can be a particular issue for Lepidoptera and insects and pollinators in general. We have, especially in agricultural settings, but even in residential settings, where we have an excess of herbicides and insecticides being used. And even you have to keep in mind that, especially if these are being broadcast sprayed as they are often in a farm type setting, that they can drift and that they can affect hedgerows and the edge of fields. They can affect some of the areas that are richest in meadow species. Violets and asters and goldenrods and milkweeds are going to be growing in those messy edges of agricultural settings, unless they're hit by some of these herbicides, in which case you're going to lose host plant, and as a result, you're going to lose butterflies. Another issue that's sort of unique to Lepidoptera is artificial lighting. Moths, in particular, are really attracted to lights at night, and human beings love to light up this their backyards and their garages and their front yards and their driveways with sometimes permanent lighting all night long. And it's problematic for a lot of moths that basically waste they just get attracted to the light and waste so much energy that they perish. And that's why you find moths on your garage in the morning afterward and dead on the ground. And I guess I'll wrap up with some recommendations for butterfly and really pollinator conservation generally. There's an increasing concern about pollinator declines. And by pollinators, people are referring to not just butterflies and moths, but bees, wasps, flies. There's a whole group of flower flies, a really diverse group that are very important for pollination, and beetles that are not important pollinators. And, you know, these are just things I thought of off the top of my head that if I had to narrow it down to some take-home points that I think could make a huge difference if more folks engaged with them. One is just learning more about what makes these species tick and why they're exciting and important and worth conserving. Because with a little bit of knowledge, you generally gather concern, and you have to have concern in order to trigger action. And so you guys are doing the right thing about joining webinars like this and learning in your free time as much as you can about nature, because that's going to lead to some of those actions. Strategic habitat conservation is key. And I guess I would just say, you know, it's very hard for any of us to do this on our own. I doubt there's a lot of millionaires or billionaires on this webinar in this room. So, yeah. So what you can do with a very small contribution is join your local land trust, because when a lot of people come together and join a land trust, those land trusts have the resources necessary to protect some really important strategic habitats. And they're not just, you know, the land trusts in Maine are pretty sophisticated, and they're using information often from our agency to target habitats for rare and at-risk plants and animals. Ones that come to mind here near Camden area are Coastal Mountain and Georges River Land Trust. But the Maine Coast Heritage Trust works all the way up and down the Maine coast and inland for a town or two. And the Nature Conservancy works statewide and, in fact, across the Western Hemisphere, and is doing a tremendous job at protecting habitats. So joining any one or all of those is going to leverage, is going to have a big legacy footprint for conserving pollinators. The other thing you can do is consider supporting invertebrate conservation organizations. One is my own organization, and we get a lot of our non-game funding, and my staff salaries come from contributions through the Loon license plate, which is the only real conservation license plate in Maine, or through the chickadee checkoff on your state income taxes. So those are important revenue sources. But Xerces Society is a really cool invertebrate conservation society nationwide. And if you just Google them, you'll find all kinds of pollinator conservation ideas there. And right here in Maine, we have our own Maine Entomological Society, which would love to have you join them on one of their field trips and get their newsletter. And finally, pollinator vegetation management. I often get questions about, you know, I've got, what I do control is the back meadow behind my house. What can I do there that would be beneficial for butterflies and pollinators? Well, you could take a little more of a laissez-faire approach, and it would go a long way towards benefiting host plants and nectar plants. And what do I mean by that? Don't get overwhelmed by this slide, and I'm sure there's a way to share this later if you really care to have it. And as I say, that on the Xerces website, you'll find this exact or very similar information. But when it comes to mowing, you basically want to do less mowing later in the year, if you had to summarize it, and if you can rotate patches so that you're not mowing the entire field or meadow every year, so that leaving little parts of the meadow to go fallow for a year, that helps create refuges and successional stages that are important for certain plants. And always maintain wide riparian buffers on any wetlands on your property, streams, swamps, ponds. And by wide, I mean tens of meters, hundreds of feet. And because that's where some very unique host plants are going to grow in that mesic, that moist zone between swamp and upland. And if you can help those plants by not mowing them every year, you're going to see diversity increase. And late season mowing is best, or early season, but in early spring or late fall. Higher blade heights, lower mowing speeds. And invasive plants, if you can flag and identify some of the invasive plants on your property and get rid of them. There's a lot in Knox and Waldo counties right around us here, and there's over 75 species in Maine. These aren't just exotic. There's over 1,000, I believe, exotic species in Maine, but these are the really problematic exotic species. These are the exotic species that are spreading like wildfire and excluding other native plants, things like Japanese knotweed, purple loosestrife, and Phragmites, and glossy buckthorn, multiflora rose. So these can take over areas, usurp habitat from the native host plants, and as a result, you see a huge decline in native insect diversity. If you want to learn more about or get guidance for how to identify and control invasive plants, reach out to the Maine Natural Areas Program, our sister agency in the Department of Agriculture, Conservation, and Forestry. A gentleman there named Chad Hammer, who is an expert on invasive species control, and would love to hear from you. And finally, be sparing in your use of herbicides. An herbicide, as the name suggests, is designed to kill herbs, not insects. And yet there have been studies that show that some of the herbicides do have sublethal impacts on behavior, immune system response, fecundity, and a lot of key components to the life history of butterflies, moths, and other pollinators. And so with that, yeah, so you're going to try to want to create some patches of habitat on your property by laying off the mowing a little bit to look a little bit more like this, basically. A little more colorful, more diverse, and ultimately more rich in wildlife as well. And that's about it. I just want to acknowledge some of the partners and experts that have helped with our invertebrate program at IFNW. As I said, I took few to none of the photographs, so I want to recognize the beautiful photography that was contributed here, and just remind you that in order to leverage the federal U.S. Fish and Wildlife dollars that are really key to our program, our non-game program, we have to match a certain amount of those, in fact 30% of them, with stateside dollars, and those dollars are mostly generated through the loon license plate and the chickadee checkoff. So thank you for your help there. And that's about it.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
We do have some questions here, and if anybody on Zoom has any additional questions, you can put them in. I think I'll start with this one since it's relevant to the previous slide. What is the Beginning with Habitat program?
Yes, thank you. I should have mentioned that. The Beginning with Habitat is a program at Maine Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife that was started by a coalition of partners, not just our agency, but Maine Natural Areas Program, Maine Audubon, Natural Resource Conservation Service, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and other partners that I'm forgetting, came together and decided there's got to be a way where we can all share what we think is the most important biodiversity information, place-based confirmed biodiversity information, with partners like towns, land trusts, and private landowners, so that limited conservation dollars can be spent in the most efficient and strategic way to target and protect these special places. And that's what the Beginning with Habitat program is all about. It basically creates a GIS sandwich of where are the hot spots on the landscape where the disproportionate amount of these species are occurring in your town or in your land trust jurisdiction. And And then they go one step further and even offer a bunch of tools that they can suggest for helping for towns and land trusts and landowners to enact things like conservation easements, both permanent and term, or fee acquisition, of course, is the Cadillac, but other, technical assistance on how you can manage a particular body of water or land for the benefit of those at-risk species. So lots of tools, and you can request a presentation to your club or your land trust, your town conservation committee or select board or planning board, more likely, by going to the website, just Googling beginning with habitat, and you'll get to the website at IFW, and there's a place to request.
That answers the next question. How does one access the information about beginning with wild?
Yeah.
So Google is my friend. Thank you. So another question is from Cindy. Could you please explain English plantain as a host plant here in Maine, as it is native to Eurasia and listed as a noxious weed? Also, FYI, I have several spice bushes that I have planted here in Thomaston, and they are doing well and blooming now. Thank you.
Yeah, spice bush is a wonderful shrub, and like its name implies, it has it's aromatic, beautiful red buds, flower buds, or fruits, sorry, in the fall. And so it gets planted outside of its native range, and I can see where it would be tempting to do so, and that's perfectly fine. It's not invasive, and it won't leave your yard, and I'm glad there's a few in Thomaston. But the native range of spice bushes in Maine is southern, it just gets into York, maybe southern Oxford and southern Cumberland counties. And same with sassafras. But yeah, the English plantain is interesting. You're right, it's a non-native plant to Maine. And Baltimore checker spots were actually doing pretty poorly in some decades ago, before they adapted to and switched over to also utilizing English plantain as a host plant. And it's just an example of how the fate of these animals is really determined by both the chemistry of the plants that they're interacting with and what we do to those plants. So those few Atlantic white cedar bogs in southern Maine, with a little bit of inappropriate development around there, without say within the riparian buffers that should exist around them, we could lose those Hessels-Air streaks very easily. Probably very few people would know. But how many different species can you lose over time before before the sort of ecological web starts to unravel? I don't know the answer to that. I don't really want to know. So I think they all matter.
The question is, if adult butterflies only live for a few weeks, how do monarchs live long enough to get to Mexico? Or is it just juvenile monarchs that make the trek?
Excellent question. Yeah, so most butterflies only live a few weeks. The adult, that group that we talked about, that dozen or so species that overwinter as adults, the few that do so here in Maine, like the mourning cloak and commas, and the migrants like the ladies and sulfurs and monarch, have much longer, like that. One of the generations has a much longer lifespan. That overwintering generation, goes into diapause, say October, November, with freezing temperatures, but they hatched, say, in October. So that last generation of monarchs that forgoes breeding and migrates to Mexico might have been born in late September, early October, is overwintering as we speak, and probably now starting to migrate north into the Gulf states and perhaps reproducing already, even on milkweed, a different species of milkweed in the Gulf states. So that would be the end of that generation, right? Once they reproduce, they pretty much perish soon thereafter. But that would be what, October, November, December, January, February, March, April. And for some, possibly May, just because we're only a couple of weeks away from there. So that's 7 or 8 months right there for your last generation of monarchs. But every other generation of monarchs, the ones that arrive here in Maine, they're back on that 2 to 3 week adult life phase until that final migratory generation. Yeah.
Yeah, it makes me wonder what prevents the other generations from trying to migrate.
They've got a good thing going on, right?
Yeah.
It's summer, the temperatures are great, they're surrounded by nectar, there's milkweed that's tender and fresh all around them to lay their
Why
eggs.
don't they?
Because they reproduce, is that why they don't live longer?
That and just every day that a butterfly is on the wing is a day there's a certain probability of them being taken by a bird or a spider, a bat or something. And so praying mantis, so you add up those probabilities day after day, and I've never been very good at probability math, but it gets pretty high. It gets pretty hard to live longer than 2 or 3 weeks. But I think part of it is the reproduction as well takes a big toll on their energy reserves. And UV radiation, even without predation, just being on the wing over a certain amount of time, every day, the radiation from the sun starts to wear away the wings and the tatter. Each time they knock their wing against a flower petal or a leaf, escape a spider web, they're losing scales on their wings, and eventually they just become very inept at flying and all the more subject to predation.
Kind of fragile.
Yeah, very fragile.
Well, thank you so much.